Hey guys, welcome to my in-depth guide on Yoimiya. If you're here, you probably watched Fate and thought Rin was best girl, which to be honest is a really good take, and you should be proud of that. But anyways, I spent weeks researching Yoimiya before release, and after spending time testing her out and cross-referencing information with Yoimiya mains, I came up with this guide. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, she's not really broken, she's just honestly pretty balanced in my opinion. People are doom posting like she's the worst character in the game and unplayable and unsalvageable, and that's just simply not true. We're going to be talking about Yoimiya's kit, constellations, artifacts, best weapons, rotation, team, and at the end there will be a showcase as well. But before we get started, I do go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone, where I test things out and just enjoy the game. So if you're interested in that sort of content, head over and drop a follow, and make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. We're going to get started with how Yoimiya's kit works. So the first big thing that I want to point out is that Yoimiya has a thing called an internal cooldown, and if you don't know what that is, basically it means that she can only react or do reaction damage on a certain timer. So Yoimiya has 5 auto attacks, and because of her internal cooldown, she can only vaporize 1, 3, and 5 if you're using Xingqiao, but typically the rest of her kit only reacts over 2.5 seconds. We'll talk about that again later. Yoimiya can generate an energy particle roughly once a second if you animation cancel her infused first attack, but in general her energy generation kind of sucks. Yoimiya's charge shot is similar to Ganyu's, where she has multiple levels to it, and every single level adds a marshmallow. They do almost no damage, but they do track enemies, so there's that. Moving on now to elemental skill, her E infuses arrows with pyro up to 161% damage multiplier at level 10, and that is multiplicative and not additive, so the damage calculations on it are a little bit different from other characters. The cooldown is 18 seconds, but the duration is 10 seconds, so that means Yoimiya will have about 8 seconds of downtime. Moving on to her elemental burst, her Q creates a mark on an enemy and does AoE pyro damage once every 2 seconds on hit, and once the enemy dies, the mark moves to another person. Yoimiya's first ascension passive is called Tricks of the Troublemaker, and essentially what it does is it gives you a 2% pyro damage bonus on every hit with a maximum of 10 stacks, and the effect lasts for 3 seconds, so essentially every single stack you get is going to reset the effect length, but as soon as you don't attack for 3 seconds, the effect disappears. And her second ascension passive, called Summer Night's Dawn, gives nearby party members, not including Yoimiya, a 10% attack increase for 15 seconds, and this is really helpful for characters that snapshot, so if you use Beto's Q when this passive is up, she'll have it for the entire duration of her Q, and the aforementioned attack buff can actually be increased by another 10% based on the stacks of Tricks of the Troublemaker that you have, so up to 10 stacks for a total of 20% attack increase. It's a pretty decent buff, and it encourages you to switch characters or to run off-field DPS. One reason that people don't really like Yoimiya is because of that internal cooldown that I mentioned at the start, which does hinder her damage a little bit, but she's still a very playable unit and a very viable unit. A lot of people don't really want to hear that, but it's facts. So next we're going to talk about her constellations and which ones get you the most value, which ones are actually worth pulling for, all that fun stuff. If you're free to play and you don't care about constellations at all, you can go ahead and skip ahead, but I thought I should go over this anyways. So to start off, her Constellation 1 extends her elemental burst by 4 seconds, which is pretty strong, and it'll make it so you only have 1 second of downtime on her Q, so this one brings a lot of value. Yoimiya's Constellation 2 makes it so that when Yoimiya does a crit with pyro, it gives her 25% pyro damage bonus for 6 seconds. It works while you're off the field too, which is a pretty nice buff. Her Constellation 3 is near useless since leveling her E barely increases damage output in relation to leveling her auto attacks, but whatever, it's a buff. Constellation 4 makes Yoimiya a little bit of a better selfish DPS because it allows her to have more field uptime by reducing the cooldown of her E every time you hit someone with your burst. Constellation 5 increases her elemental burst by 3 levels, and Constellation 6 makes it so that normal attacks have a 50% chance to shoot an extra kindling arrow that does 60% of its normal damage. So basically it's just an extra chunk of damage. It ends up being a lot of bonus damage in the end, and definitely a stronger constellation. So on screen now we have a comparison of constellation power based on the Yoimiya master sheet linked in the description. Basically, if you're going for constellations, if you're not going to go all the way to C6, C2 is the furthest you should go to increase Yoimiya's power. To be honest, that's all I really wanted to talk about with constellations, is which ones are worth it. So let's move on to artifacts now. Everyone and their mother's preaching that Shimenawa's Reminiscence is the best in slot, and I understand why you would think that because the effect seems tailored to Yoimiya, but I'm going to kind of explain why that isn't always true and then what you can do to fix it. So I have heard every single argument in the book, and let me just start off by saying that if you play the character right with a perfect team composition and optimal rotation, Shimenawa is 10% better than Crimson Witch and Gladiator. However, if you're a more casual player who's still looking looking to get the most out of Yoimiya, it might not be for you. The 50% normal attack damage bonus is huge, but after testing and theory crafting it, the consensus is that if you actually want to outdamage other sets we're about to talk about, you have to have an off-field battery like Fischl or Electro MC, and they have to just be like front-loading Yoimiya with energy. With other sets, you're able to use their burst and still consistently get whatever damage bonuses they have, but with Shimenawa, you'll need to have a battery that's able to get you enough energy to use its effect and still use your burst, because if you just ignore your burst, Shimenawa loses out to the other sets. So let's talk about those other sets. The first one I want to talk about is 2-piece Crimson Witch and 2-piece Gladiator. It's my personal favorite set, and though in theory crafting it's 10% worse than Shimenawa, it ends up being a lot more flexible. 2-piece Crimson and 2-piece Gladiator can be run in Overload, Vaporize, or Melt, or even Mono-pyro, and it allows you to swap Yoimiya in and out whenever, whatever the time is, and still get the most value out of the set. You can also replace Gladiator with Shimenawa, and it's the same, and Shimenawa is like farmable Gladiator essentially, so that makes it a little bit easier to build. But outside of that, if you consistently use reaction teams, you can use 4-piece Crimson Witch, and it'll slightly beat out 2 and 2 because of the reaction damage bonus. Between 2 Crimson Witch and 2 Gladiator and 4-piece Crimson Witch, I prefer 2 Crimson Witch to Gladiator for reasons I specified before. The flexibility is really nice. However, technically 4-piece Crimson Witch is going to outdamage it, so that's between you and your RNG to decide if those substats are worth the switch. They're both pretty close. And one last thing I want to talk about is Copium Walkers, which is slightly less copium than I give it credit for. Mono-pyro isn't really a bad option since Yoimiya's internal cooldown that stops it from reacting fast makes reaction teams not as valuable as with other pyro DPS. Essentially what I'm saying is that if you use Xingqiu on your Diluc team, you're going to get more value out of Xingqiu there than you would using Xingqiu with Yoimiya. So it's better to put those precious resources like Xingqiu into a team that can benefit more from it. At least that's the concept around it. I don't necessarily agree with it, but you can ask any of the theory crafters and Yoimiya mains and they'll all probably tell you the same thing, that it's a fine thing to build. We'll talk about the teams that make this work later, but just for now, know that if you do go for a Mono-pyro team, Lava Walkers is a really strong option. So the TLDR is technically Shimenawa is BIS, but Crimson Witch and variants are easier to use and almost as much damage. I'll be making a video for more niche or fun Yoimiya builds, including things like Thundering Fury, Physical, and other things. Consider subscribing if you want to see those videos when they come out. It should be over the next couple days. But now that I've told you which artifacts are the best, we're going to talk about stats. And this one should be fairly simple if you've seen other build guides before. For your carries, you typically want attack percent Sands, pyro damage Goblet, and crit damage or crit rate circlets. Since Yoimiya's Ascension scaling is crit rate, it's likely that people will need to lean towards crit damage, but the main thing is that you want to have close to a 1-to-2 ratio of crit rate to crit damage. If you're wondering about Elemental Mastery Sands, it's not really worth it since she's not able to consistently melt or vaporize every hit. There's also talk of attack percent Goblets being not so bad after all for certain characters, namely characters like Xiao who have additive damage scaling. However, Yoimiya has multiplicative damage scaling, which as of this moment is pretty unique. Attack percent Goblets aren't all bad, but they're a little bit tougher to use on her. If you're a Hyper Whale with C2 Yoimiya and Thundering Pulse, the higher refinement you get, the closer attack and pyro damage Goblets get. So if you're a whale, you can decide based on your substats essentially. If you have a cracked out attack Goblet with R5 Thundering Pulse or something close to that, you can use that over pyro damage and you'll probably do a little bit more damage. But this really only applies to whales. Like you have to have C2 for it to count. For reference, with the stats I'm running on my Yoimiya, with R5 Thundering Pulse, attack Goblet is 0.04% better than a pyro damage Goblet. But if you want to compare artifacts, you can use the tool I linked in the description. It'll take you to a website where you can enter stats and it'll basically calculate which ones are better. As for substats, you want to go with crit rate or crit damage, attack percent, and energy recharge since Yoimiya's energy recharge is kind of awful. She only generates a particle once every first auto with infusion, and you can auto once, wait a second, and auto again to force generate energy, but it's still not that great. But that should be all you need to know about what kind of artifacts to build and why to build them. Now we're going to talk about weapons because this is the next most crucial part. To keep this section condensed, I'll talk about some of the biggest winners and link a weapon damage spreadsheet so you can find weapons that I didn't talk about in the video and where they rank. To nobody's surprise, Yoimiya's best in slot is Thundering Pulse. It's literally made around her kit, but Skyward Harp and Amos Bow are also really good stat sticks if you don't have access to Thundering. Something worth noting is that Rust is absolutely insane on Yoimiya because you don't really use her charged attacks and it also buffs normals. An R5 Rust, for example, is only 1% worse than an R5 Skyward Harp, so it's really, really tight. The tough thing with Rust is that it makes it harder to build crit in comparison to something like Harp, but the damage bonus is really nice and it's accessible to lucky free-to-play players. Unlike me, who spent a lot of money on the game and didn't get Rust until AR55. Hamayumi and Prototype Crescent are sort of neck and neck if you're free to play. I like Hamayumi more, but if you're building Shimenawa, it's kind of just not worth it. So I would use Prototype Crescent if you are using Shimenawa, and just in general, Prototype Crescent is probably the safer bet, but either one will work. The Viridescent Hunt and Blackcliff Warbow are also great middle options that are better than your free to play options, but still worse than Rust. Again, the link to this sheet is in the description, so if you do want to take a look at it for yourself, yourself, and if I didn't mention your favorite weapon, it might be on there. Now, before we get into teams, which is the final portion of the build section, I do want to talk about rotation really quick because it's relevant to what set you're using. To make 4-piece Shimenawa do the most damage and beat out the flexibility of other sets, you need to use Yoimiya's E, quickly get 15 energy, and then use her burst. If you're not using 4-piece Shimenawa, you should be using burst and a skill to get the cooldowns to be closer to be synced, but if you do want to learn more specifics about burst and skill order, you can check out the Shimenawa energy conflict document in the description. Essentially, the big takeaway here is that burst into skill is going to be a little bit stronger, but if you're using Shimenawa, you can't do that order. It's also worth noting that with Thundering Pulse, Q into E is the best way to get 3 stacks quickly. But as for auto rotations, the biggest takeaway is going to be that Yoimiya's 5th auto and finishing her combo every time yields the best damage based on frame data. On my last Yoimiya video, I discussed animation canceling, but it can hurt your reaction windows, and double tapping aim can be kind of inconsistent. Not to mention Yoimiya's 5th auto attack just hits like a truck. So moving on now to teams, this is the final piece of the puzzle you're missing to build your Yoimiya. We'll be looking at a reaction team and a Mono-pyro team with some different substitutes that are pay to play and free to play accessible. So even if you don't have a unit, stay tuned because I might suggest a substitute for it or tell you how to fill that position. So let's get started with the best reaction team options. Essentially, Xingqiu is going to be your best friend if you can spare him. You can vaporize normal 1, normal 3, and normal 5 to give yourself a boost in damage, and he provides a bit of healing and fortification. You guys already know how awesome Xingqiu is. He's a great off-field DPS unit who can also proc your ult as Yoimiya, so definitely a good investment. A lot of other guys are going to try to tell you that her burst isn't that important because she can't proc it herself, but that's what off-field DPS are for. I've only really heard that excuse from people on Shimenawa Copium, so outside of Xingqiu, you can run off-field DPS and supports like Beidou and Fischl, which will give you an overload and can work with Xingqiu to vaporize and overload together. It's called vape load. The nice thing about Fischl and Beidou is that Fischl's going to batter your team the entire time, while Beidou will help you do AoE damage, since Yoimiya doesn't really have a lot of that. If you can't spare Xingqiu though, you can replace him with Bennett for a team of Yoimiya, Beidou, Fischl, and Bennett, and that team will still perform pretty well. Bennett has extra synergy with Yoimiya at C6, and since I'm a Yoimiya main now, I'm going to bite the bullet for 25% more pyro damage bonus. And alternatively, you can flex Beidou for another AoE DPS or a grouping tool like Venti or Sucrose, and that will work just fine. If you like Electro MC and you want to play them with Yoimiya, they are viable since they'll always overload. They'll always be the one to proc it if you don't have Electro on first. And even if Electro is procced first, the Lightning Strike doesn't happen until after the initial hit, so that means Electro Traveler's hit will always come after Yoimiya's. If you're going to run Electro MC, you should be running Elemental Mastery on him, and it's worth noting that Electro MC can also drop 12 energy on the ground, which makes activating Shimenawa a little bit easier. I still don't really recommend it, but it's not awful. Those are my suggestions for a reaction-based team, but check out the pinned comment for additions or changes as time goes on. So now we're going to look at Mono-pyro, and the only reason Mono-pyro works is because a lot of the resources and reaction teams don't directly affect Yoimiya as much as they do other characters due to her internal cooldown. So basically, it just means that her ceiling is lower for damage. I don't know, I'm just trying to think of 1,000 excuses to run Mono-pyro. Yoimiya is a pretty good one. If you want to use this team concept, you'll want 2 pyro units, so Yoimiya and someone else like Yanfei, Xiangling, or Bennett, someone else who can do damage or support pretty well. Well, I guess that's every character, huh? Except for maybe Xinyan. The other 2 spots can be more pyro, or you can just use Geo or Anemo supports like Sayu and Kazuha. Kazuha is the best support you can use in Mono-pyro, since he's going to buff your pyro damage a ton and reduce enemy pyro resistance with the Viridescent set. However, if you're running Geo supports, you can use Zhongli and Albedo as great supports for each other and for the rest of your team. They'll constantly create shields because Zhongli's shield is literally made of titanium alloy, 6 times hardened, and Albedo makes rocks explode on the field while he's nowhere to be seen. But in general, he does a lot of damage and really helps out with Crystallize as well, so if your Zhongli shield does go down, you will have Crystallized shields. Yoimiya can really benefit from a shield. They're criminally underrated on her, and if you don't have Zhongli, Noelle is a great substitute. Once again, everything that I've talked about in this video is linked down below, including the teams list. There's a whole teams document that I referenced for this, and there's way too many teams to talk about in one video, or maybe even 3 videos, but just tons of great information, so if you want to read those, they are down in the description. And that's basically everything you need to know about team comps, so now we're going to move on to a quick Yoimiya showcase. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing, and if you learned anything, make sure to let me know in the comments. I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the showcase.